Good evening, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to, I believe this is our sixth installment of our spring 2021 Tennessee Master Beef Producer webinar series. Like I have been with each of the webinars in the spring series, and as we did in the fall, I'd like to make a few introductory comments and remind you of how the platform operates in case this is your first time joining us. Then I'll introduce our speaker, and then we'll have our presentation for the evening. So one thing to remember that I'd like to start out with each of these is our partnership with the U.S. Roundtable for Sustainable Beef and partners within the U.S. Roundtable, Golden State Foods and Nestle. They've been kind enough to support our work here in delivering this set of webinars for the state of Tennessee and our Master Beef Producer program. Part of our objective here in this webinar series in working with the U.S. Roundtable and Golden State Foods and Nestle is to establish a baseline for where we are on sustainable production of beef cattle. We know that in a lot of ways we are sustainable in what we do in cow-calf production in Tennessee and also in stocker production and some finishing. But we want to be able to know where we are, but also to establish the metrics or to at least test the metrics that the U.S. Roundtable has already established. They've worked diligently to do that and to make sure that those are accurate so that we can determine where we are, but more importantly, how to advance our sustainable production, our sustainability in what we do. So really excited to work with them. And then for us in the partnership in Tennessee, that gives us a voice in the sustainability conversation. We know there are a lot of definitions out there about what sustainability is. And we, just like the U.S. Roundtable, is made up of a lot of players in the industry. We want to be a part of that. And that's why the UT Institute of Agriculture is a member. And through our associations and networking within that group, we were able to form this partnership. And then finally, too, to provide a means by which you will have some competitive advantage if the market moves in the direction of, providing more support, more market support for sustainably produced feeder cattle. So obviously a great partnership that is a great benefit to us as Tennessee cattle producers and those of us that help you as Tennessee cattle producers, and also hopefully to the U.S. Roundtable and to Golden State Foods and Nestle in kind. So just want to start out by thanking them at each one of these webinars, and excited to be a part of that and see where that leads us in the state of Tennessee. I'll also remind you that since this is a webinar platform in Zoom and not a regular meeting, that we don't see your video and we don't hear your audio. So if you'd like to communicate with us, there's a couple of different ways. One way that we like to interact with you is having some of these poll questions presented throughout the webinar tonight. Here you see an example on my screen. This is what it'll look like provided that you're viewing on a desktop application or on your phone. If you're viewing in a web browser, you won't see this, but don't worry about that. We'll have enough answers to be able to interact with a good sampling of those of you watching this evening, and I'll give our speaker some direction, some indication of where we are with some of these. We will, I'll remind you at this point too, we will have a survey link that's available at the end of this and also emailed out to you tomorrow at about this time. And that's where we'll get some more detailed feedback of where you are in genetics and give us an indication of how to move ahead and provide better educational material for you, especially to those sustainability metrics. And then also that's the way we'll kind of keep your attendance record as well as through that survey. Also, though, if you'd like to interact with us, there are a couple of different ways. Primarily, if you'd like to ask a question about the subject matter that's presented, you'll use the Q&A box. I'll be watching that this evening as Troy presents, and I call it kind of curating the questions, and we'll have the Q&A at the end based on what you put in the Q&A box throughout the presentation. I may be able to answer a few of those as we go along, but most of those, if yours stays in that box as we go along, that's because I'm kind of saving it to ask Troy at the end. So those are the two primary ways that you can communicate with us. If you have a question for either myself or Courtney Carter, who's another moderator this evening here on the webinar, you can also type that in the chat if it's more about the functionality of the platform or the program in general. So with that, I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, Troy Rowan. Dr. Rowan is a relatively new faculty member here at the University of Tennessee Animal Science Department. He's also part of the College of Veterinary Medicine and is housed within and works primarily within our genomics center. I think the last webinar series we did in the fall, we had Dr. Beaver presented as part of that, and Troy's come on to faculty since then. And I wanted to quickly get him in front of you and presenting the information that he deals with. Really excited to have Troy on animal science faculty. Already started working with him, writing some grants with him, and planning to do some long-term type work of that measuring phenotype that supports the genotype work that they do in the genomics center. Troy's a farm boy from Iowa out there in farmer feeder country. And has just a really good training, both academically and boots on the ground type of training as well in beef cattle genetics. So we asked him to come to the webinar series tonight to talk about sire selection. For those of you that are commercial cow-calf producers, if you're a seed stock producer, certainly this will be very much something you'll be interested in as you're making bull genetics, sire genetics to go into the commercial herd. So Troy, with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to you. And if you'd like to give them any more indication of your background, go right ahead. But I wanted to leave plenty of time for you to talk about sire selection this evening.
All righty, thanks, Justin. And I'll go ahead and share my screen here. And let's see. Get my laser set up. All right, are we good here?
Looks great.
Looks good. All right. Well, I just want to say a big thanks to Justin and Courtney and the whole Master Beef Producers crew for having me on tonight. I really have been impressed over the last, I guess, 2 months I've been in Tennessee. So I'm still, like Justin said, really new, but impressed with the sort of attention and resources that your government, your university put into the beef industry here in Tennessee. I think that there's a really strong commitment to furthering the beef industry across all sectors here in Tennessee. And I think that this Master Beef Producers program is just a big aspect of that. So I'm really, really thrilled to be here with you all tonight and hope that I can be a resource for you all moving forward. You have lots of the county-based extension programming here is really unparalleled. Anywhere else that I've been exposed to extension, that's something really unique. You have people in every county that are resources for you, and hopefully I can be a resource to both them as well as you, and keep moving Tennessee's beef cow herd forward. So with that, we'll dive right in. Courtney gave me this topic of sire selection for commercial cow-calf producers, which is about a 2-semester undergraduate class. I feel like I could pack a lot of information into an hour. So what we're going to talk about tonight is going to be sort of a starting point. I know that everybody's sort of at different points in certain pieces might be more or less valuable. I'm really welcome to that feedback, but I hope that what we can do tonight, instead of outlining a bunch of sort of straightforward, concrete things to do, that this gets you at least asking the right questions and moving down the right path. So without that, I will jump right in and give you a brief outline of what I'm going to talk about tonight. I'm going to break sire selection into the 4 components that I think we want to spend the most time with. The first is this idea of developing a breeding goal. This is something that doesn't get talked about a whole lot at these sort of extension genetics type of programming events. But I think that it's really, really important that no matter what our herd size is, that we're raising cattle in a way that isn't just a routine, right? Breed cows, have calves, sell calves. I really think that we need to be working towards something. Again, no matter what your herd size is, how involved you are, having a breeding goal that really fits what you're trying to do, that makes your herd more profitable is really, really important. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time just talking about that. And then we'll jump into this idea that will become sort of will be a broken record over the next few years. You'll hear me talking about crossbreeding. This is something that I think that the American cow herd isn't doing enough of. In the commercial sector, we're leaving a lot of money on the table in a lot of places by not leveraging heterosis through crossbreeding. So I'll talk a little bit about heterosis and crossbreeding and the practical ways that you can implement a little bit of that into your herd if it's not something that you're working with at this point. Then I'll dive into the meat and potatoes of any good genetics extension talk, where we'll talk about EPDs, the genomic aspect of EPDs, and how we're working constantly to try and make better selection tools through the form of EPDs, so that you can make quicker genetic progress in your herds, whether you're a commercial breeder or a seed stock producer. And then finally, I'll wrap things up talking about selection indexes. None of these breeding goals that we have are going to be one trait. We're not going to be selecting for a single trait at a time. So finding a simple, profit-driven, straightforward way to select animals as the ones that we include in our program is something that I think is really important, that maybe doesn't get talked about enough. So with that, I'm gonna jump right into the first topic here. In breeding cattle without a goal is a little bit like this blindfolded long jumper, right? We can be in a cow herd, moving in the right direction, doing the right thing, but if we're missing that sort of that direction forward, looking at what's in front of us, having that goal that we're working towards, we're not only sacrificing the distance that we're jumping, but we can often find ourselves landing outside of the sand pit, which is obviously not ideal. So as we think about developing a breeding goal, it's really just giving ourselves all the information and a clear sight on what we're trying to achieve. And I think that it's a really, really important thing that we need to focus on. So the first thing that I start off talking about when it comes to breeding goals is simply asking, in your herd, no matter how big, what generates income, right? Are you selling calves at weaning? Is that where the most of your net income is coming from? Are you marketing replacement heifers? Are you retaining replacement heifers? Are you getting paid for performance on the grid? So are you retaining ownership and selling your cattle on some sort of a performance-based grid? So the big question here, right, is where do I get premiums, and am I making breeding decisions that are reflected in my pocketbook, right? So that goes into this this next bit, right, where what in my cow herd needs improved, right? Am I trying to make continual improvement on these income traits? If I'm selling my calves at weaning, am I trying to make solid genetic progress over time on weaning weight? Or is it something more complex, right? Something that doesn't show up in the balance sheet that's really important to the success of my cow herd. So whether that's reproductive or structural soundness, these are things that you might not get written a check for explicitly, but most certainly affect the profitability of your herd. So as we start to think about making breeding goals, this is really the meat of it, right? Figuring out what in my cow herd needs improved, and then doing the sort of sire selection and female-based selection that it takes to make that improvement over the long term in your herd. And then some other things that I think are important to keep in mind too are, what's your production environment? We can have a breeding goal to wean off the biggest, heaviest calves, right? But if our production environment doesn't allow these cows and calves to reach their genetic potential, we're really wasting maybe resources in trying to push for that genetic gain, right? So thinking about the forage availability in your area, whether you're trying to raise low input cattle, if you're not going to be out there supplementing calves, if you don't need that sort of gain, if you're selling at weaning, then like these are all things that we need to think about, and these are all things that are going to play into developing a breeding goal, right? And then finally, what's my management level? Am I doing purely natural services? Have I implemented artificial insemination? What does my calving season look like? All of these things play into what your breeding goal is going to be, right? When it comes to sire selection and female side selection, these things are all going to be really important for you moving forward. So what I've done here isn't necessarily outlined exactly what your breeding goal should look like. I don't think that there's any one single breeding goal that fits every operation. There are no silver bullets, in something that you'll hear me talk about a lot throughout all of my extension programming is it depends, right? So I think that we can lay down some basic questions, start asking the questions that we need to, and then as we start to dial in on specific herds, we can flesh out more exactly what a breeding goal should look like. But I think that all breeding goals, regardless of the herd, should be attainable. These should be realistic selection goals that you can accomplish in your herd, right? And this is going to depend a little bit on the size of your herd. Can you bring in a bunch of different bulls to introduce, genetic variation, or do you have maybe a 30 cow herd where you're going to be breeding to a single bull? That's going to impact the selection decisions that you're making on the bull side. And then these also, again, have to work in your production environment. So if you're in an environment that maybe has substandard forage, you maybe don't want to be selecting for cows that are going to be heavy milkers and big and growthy mature cows. So we need to have something that's attainable and that fits in our production environment. The next thing that I think is really important is that our breeding goals need to be measurable, right? We need to be able to record what's happening in our herd and go back and give some feedback to ourselves and say, is what I'm trying to accomplish in this herd, is this actually being accomplished based on the measurements and the metrics that I'm able to gather in my herd over time, right? Because when we're breeding with cattle, these generation intervals are a lot longer than if we were in the pig business or the chicken business, right? So we're not seeing that quick generational turnover where we can maybe even remember what happened in the last generation. So being able to measure these outcomes in some way or another is really important. And then that feeds into the third thing that I think is really important is that breeding goals need to be flexible, right? So if there's something, say you have feet and leg issues, maybe when you set out and make your breeding goal, or rather you don't have feet and leg issues, right? But 5 years down the line, you figure out that structural soundness in your herd is maybe suffering a little bit. Figuring out ways to make your breeding goal flexible to accommodate those changes that you want to see in your cow herd is really important. But at the same time, I think we need to be conscientious about not swinging back and forth to vastly different selection goals. We need to have some sort of consistency, right? Because as soon as we start going in a direction with our selection decisions, it doesn't do us a whole lot of good to do a 180 and go back with something completely different. So finding a selection goal that's sustainable, that makes sense over the long term in your herd is what will allow you to see that big time genetic gain over time, right? This isn't something that you're going to see over the course of months, right? But if you stick with a constant breeding goal over the course of years, we can really see the payoff in our cow herds. So the last thing that I'll say about breeding goals as they relate to sire selection is that these decisions need to drive the genetic progress that align with your herd's breeding goals, right? And I think that's really important no matter where we're at in our production history, right? If we've been in the business for 50 years, I think it's still important that we reflect on these breeding goals and that we make the sire selection decisions that we need to get us there, right? So that was a really quick and dirty run through the questions that I ask when it comes to coming up with breeding goals. Again, I didn't say any one size fits all breeding goal that works in every operation all the time, but hopefully this is enough to get us all asking the right questions to start to flesh out what a breeding goal might look like in our herds. So with that, I'm gonna jump into one of my favorite pet soapboxes and just say that heterosis and crossbreeding are two things that I think the American beef herd is really lagging on. I think that I've seen some figures and it's really astounding the percentage of commercial cow operations that are using straight bred animals, right? And at the end of the day, that might work in some cases, but in other cases, again, this isn't a one size fits all deal, but a lot of herds are leaving a lot of money on the table every year because they're not utilizing crossbreeding. So I'm going to dive into my first poll question of the night. If Courtney wants to launch that. And the question is pretty simple. Are you utilizing crossbreeding in your herds? Yes or no? Or option C, if you don't have a commercial herd, maybe you're a seed stock producer, go ahead and answer this question. That would be much appreciated, and we'll get some feedback here.
And I'll probably give it about 4 seconds, so you should see it on your screen.
Courtney, do you have any jokes ready for this evening? We didn't tell Troy that that's part of the deal, that you tell a really witty and thought-provoking joke whenever the poll questions are up.
Yeah, I think it'll better align with question 2, so I'll save it.
Okay.
Okay, I'm about to share results with you, Troy.
All right. That is his. So can everybody see these, or is this just me, Courtney?
They can see them.
They can see them. Okay. So yeah, 56% of our herds are using crossbreeding. So that's about over twice as many herds are utilizing crossbreeding as aren't, which is better than the national average. I'll tell you that much. So that's encouraging, but still, I really am excited about the sort of future of crossbreeding. This is something that we've known about for a really long time, but I think that it's still something that we can do better at in our cow herds. And something that we can continue to make genetic progress that just gets accelerated when we utilize crossbreeding. So with that, I'm gonna jump in and talk a little bit about crossbreeding and the fact that there are sort of a twofold advantage to utilizing crossbreeding. So the first is this idea of breed complementarity. So things that even if you had a purebred animal of a breed, you would see this as being a strength of that animal. So the ones that I always point out are Charolais, lean growth, Red Angus fertility, these traits that we associate with individual breeds that they're going to contribute no matter what, whether they're used in crossbreeding or not. And what this allows you to do in the context of crossbreeding is we can start to align multiple breed strengths and stack them on top of each other, right? So as we develop these more maternal breeds, we can stack good maternal with good milk and good direct growth, things that we're able to pass on in more of an additive manner. And then when we utilize crossbreeding, we also experience heterosis, which is sort of this miraculously beautiful biological process that we don't have a great understanding of how it works, right? We're still trying to dig into the actual biological mechanism of what heterosis is, but the results are really clear, right? And this is when we're seeing that the performance of a crossbred offspring is superior significantly compared to its parental averages, right? So again, something that we're still trying to work out exactly what's going on under the hood, but the results are really hard to ignore. And I like to think about heterosis as sort of free performance, right? This is something that we've known about for a long time in corn, where we can take these two inbred lines that are pretty measly and sad looking, cross them together and get this big, robust hybrid whose yield is over twice what the two parental lines are. So this is something that we've been doing for 150 years in plant breeding, and we've recognized that the same thing happens in animal breeding as well. Though we're not able to get the same sort of inbred lines that corn does, we're still able in these divergent breeds to see that this F1 cross between, say, a Hereford and Angus is going to be far superior to purebred animals of either of these lines, just due to this heterotic advantage. So something that I think is really interesting for us to look at moving forward. This can be something that my research program tries to probe a little bit more on the sort of molecular and biological basis of heterosis, but something that it's really hard to ignore the results of in the commercial cow herd. So it's time for my second question here, and I guess Courtney's big joke of the night is, which trait is the highest priority in your herd to make genetic progress on?
Okay, and Troy, my joke is, how does NASA organize a party?
How does NASA organize a party? I don't know.
They plan it.
No, that's good.
All the other participants laughed. They just don't have audio, so you couldn't hear them.
Yeah. No, I figured that was probably the case.
And Troy, that's one of the better ones of the series.
I'll give about 10 more seconds for y'all to answer.
One of the better ones.
Indeed.
Okay, about to share results with you.
All right. All right. So the overwhelming answer here is calf growth and performance. a handful of folks that are interested in increasing carcass traits and feed efficiency. Herd health is a little bit higher than I maybe would have thought. And then fertility and cow longevity, something that are notoriously hard to make genetic progress on, our second most common answer there. So the reason that I asked this question while I'm talking about heterosis is that the effects of heterosis are going to differ based on the trait that we're looking at, right? So typically, the lower the heritability of a trait, so the lower amount of sort of additive genetics that we see in a trait, the larger the effects from heterosis are going to be. And on a more quantitative genetic basis, this is because heterosis, we think, is due in some part to these sort of non-additive ways of genetic inheritance, whereas the things that go into calculating heritability are the purely additive components of these traits. So that's sort of something else that we can dive into on another night. But really, the big takeaway here is that for these high heritability traits, so for carcass and in product measurements, mature weight, the heritability is fairly high, which means we're going to see fairly low levels of heterosis. Whereas for things like growth rate, weaning weight, yearling weight, these are by far the most important traits to a lot of commercial cow-calf producers. These are medium heritability, so somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.2 to 0.5 heritability, which means that you're going to get a medium heterotic advantage. So these F1 animals are going to have a 5 to 10% increase compared to the average of those two parental breeds. But really, the big place that we can start to utilize heterosis is in these low heritability traits. So the traits that are the hardest to make genetic progress on because they're lowly heritable, so these things like reproduction, cow health, longevity, things that are somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20% heritable, we see that the level of heterosis is really, really high. So somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 30%. And that's why this black baldy cow has become sort of the icon of heterosis, right? Because she's so fertile, she's long lived in the herd, just a really exceptional example of what we want cows to be. And that's because this heterotic component to all of these maternal traits that we care about is quite large. And so I think it's important to think about heterosis not only as adding pounds, which it certainly will, right? A 10% jump in weaning weight just by utilizing a crossbred bull is a big factor. But really the gains that we see in these female traits, if you're retaining ownership of your replacement heifers, the gains in fertility and cow longevity, the things that are the hardest to make genetic progress on are the things that you're going to see the biggest advantage in these crossbred cows with. I also think that it's important to note that from an economic perspective, these commercial cow herds are going to be best served when we have long-lived cows, right? So we want to minimize the number of replacement heifers that we're bringing into the herd each year. We want these cows to be productive long into their lives. So these traits that see the biggest advantages due to heterosis are going to enable you to do this. So again, even though this might not be showing up on your on the check that gets written at the sale barn if you're selling calves at weaning, these are things that are going to make a big economic impact on your herd over the long term. And so one of the big complaints about crossbreeding, or maybe the big hurdles to crossbreeding, is that it's often viewed as being a complex thing. And there certainly are crossbreeding programs that are really complex, that entail quite a bit of coordination and resources. But I think it's important to realize that we can utilize crossbreeding even in some pretty straightforward ways in sort of the average beef herd. So this is taken from an extension publication from eBeef. So eBeef is a resource that I'll plug here while I'm thinking about it. A bunch of land grant institution extension beef specialists. We've come together and put out a bunch of fact sheets relating to all aspects of cow herd genetics. And this is the one on crossbreeding for the commercial beef producer. One that I found very, very interesting as I've been thinking about this issue of heterosis and crossbreeding. And I pulled this right from here, and there's lots of other good resources there. So I'll plug eBeef for all of your needs in genetics. there's probably a fact sheet there. And if there's not, shoot me an email and I will write one, as I'm always looking for something else to put down on paper. But anyways, I'll walk through really quickly some of these different crossbreeding programs and how they might fit into your particular herd, depending on the complexity of these and what your herd might look like. So the two things that we'll pay attention to, right, is the percent advantage. So this is the percent bump that you would get from that F1 individual. And then this idea of retained heterosis. So heterosis that gets to stay in the herd due typically to these cows that are crossbred, right? So if we can maximize both the heterotic advantage of our herd and the amount of heterosis that we're keeping in the herd, these are both things that are really important. So sort of the typical approach to heterosis that we maybe think of the most often is we have a breed, say we have Angus, and we put a terminal cross on. So we put a Charolais bull on an Angus cow, and we have this two breed terminal cross, we'll say, where you're marketing all of the calves, you're not retaining any replacement females. So in this case, you're getting a decent bump from heterosis, but you're not retaining any of that in the herd because you're using that purebred cow. This is fairly simple, any herd size, and it's just using two breeds. But as we start to ramp things up and think about doing breed rotations, things get a little bit more complex. All of a sudden, we're dealing with multiple breeding pastures as we're rotating these sires through. And then we have to have certain herd requirements. So these herds need to be of a certain size for this to work. And the number of breeds that we get involved becomes more and more complex. But what you'll see is that with the increasing complexity, we see an increase in the heterosis that we observe, as well as the amount of heterosis that we retain from generation to generation. So with this retained heterosis, you're seeing not only that calf added, or that direct heterosis in the calf, but heterosis in the maternal traits. So these cows are making more milk on less input, and they're staying in the herds longer as we retain this heterosis within the herd. And then as we start to think about things like composite breeds, so breeds that are many generations in, typically we think about tropical breeds like Santa Gertrudis, Beefmaster. All of these are composite breeds where we have multiple breeds. And so without introducing any sort of a rotation, we're able to have a single breeding pasture, any size herd, but we're still able to get that advantage of heterosis as well as retain some of that in our herd. So again, these composite breeds are becoming more and more common, particularly if we're able to introduce Bos indicus in there. But one of the other things that I think is really valuable for beef producers in Tennessee to think more about is this idea of utilizing F1 bulls. So the availability of Sim Angus bulls is a really big resource for introducing some heterosis into your herd, particularly if you can have an F1 bull on an F1 cow of 4 different breeds. You can experience some pretty massive heterosis here, and you're able to retain this in your herd in a fairly uncomplex manner. So again, there are books full of these crossbreeding plans and how to maximize heterosis. It's going to depend on the breeds that you're utilizing. So you're not going to see the same amount of heterosis if you're crossing an Angus with a red Angus as you would crossing an Angus with a Charolais. So these are all things to keep in mind. I think that this article that I've linked does a really good job of laying some of these things out, but just an introduction to crossbreeding in all of its complexity. And I think that with that, I'm gonna jump into the third part of the presentation here, where I'm going to talk about EPDs, sort of what they are on a really basic level, how we can utilize them in our commercial herds, and then what this next step of genomics, which is maybe a buzzword in a lot of senses, what this does to our EPDs, sort of what that changes and what really just stays the same as we evolve into this genomic era of genetic prediction. So this is this is probably an equation that you saw in one of your high school biology classes, maybe, where we say that the phenotype of an individual is some combination of that individual's genotype and their environment. So in the context of your calf crop, at the end of the year, what you get paid for is the phenotype of these calves, right? Nobody's writing you a check at the sale barn based on the EPD profile of your calves, probably. So this phenotype is going to be made up of the environment on your farm. So this entails not only the outside conditions, right? The weather, the forage availability, but also the management. Are you creep feeding these calves? What sort of care are these calves getting outside of the context of what the actual physical weather at your place might be? And then the genotype of these calves is the genetic potential of your cow herd. So the bulls and cows in your cow herd and what they're passing on, the genetic potential that they're giving to this calf crop. And so the same thing goes for when we're thinking about selecting a bull. This bull's phenotype is going to be some combination of his genotype and his environment. So in the context of a bull, his appearance and his individual performance, if we think about this bull's weaning weight, his weaning weight ratio, whatever that might be, is going to be a combination of his environment. So this is where a bull was raised, how he was managed in the lead up to sale day. But really, when it comes to making genetic progress in your herd, understanding that what you're buying this bull for is his genotype, not necessarily his phenotype, right? So this bull could be an exceptional performer, but if most of that performance comes from the favorable environment that he was put in, he's not going to be able to contribute this to his offspring, which is really what makes money in your herd, is what this animal can put into the calf crops that he's a part of. So just an illustration of what this looks like, right, is that if we're doing selection based on these animals' phenotypes, we're comparing two bulls here. Say we're increased in both weaning and post-weaning gain. It's pretty clear that if these two bulls are raised in the same environment, that bull B is more likely to be genetically superior to bull A, right? He has a 50-pound heavier weaning weight and 100-pound heavier yearling weight. So there's likely something that, if these bulls, all things are held the same, makes bull B genetically superior to bull A. But if we realize that these bulls were raised in two vastly different environments, right, all of a sudden that decision becomes a little bit hazier, right? So if bull A is out grazing the scrub brush of West Texas, whereas bull B is belly high in fescue on the Tennessee Plateau, all of a sudden this becomes a little bit different as we start to think about the groceries that were available to this bull's mother and the performance that he was able to experience based on these environments. It's going to differ. So really, at the end of the day, if we're doing phenotypic selection, we're not accounting for these important environmental differences that can play into performance. And what that means is that the selection that we do, if we're basing it off of these animals' phenotypes, is going to be less accurate than if we were just focused on what that animal can contribute to its offspring in the form of genetics. So the way that the business that I'm in, right, is figuring out how can we dissect the variation in phenotype that's due to an animal's environment versus what's due to that animal's genotype. And ultimately what we want to do when we're selecting bulls is find ways to focus in on the genotype and throw away that environmental variation that bull can't contribute onto its offspring. So when it comes to animal breeding, the way that we're able to do this is using contemporary groups. So animals that are raised in a similar environment, similar management and production practices. We're able to pull out that variation in contemporary groups. And what that leaves us is just the genetic component of an animal's phenotype in the form of an EPD. So the important thing for us to keep in mind is that an animal's true genetic merit is always going to be unknown, right? We don't actually know what genes exactly that animal has. But what we're able to do is that statistically, through the use of EPDs, we're able to estimate what that animal's actual genetic merit is. And so that allows us to select on what that animal, or what we think that animal is going to pass on to its offspring. So as we start to think about EPDs, what they look like in practice, I think that it's helpful to break out EPDs into each of their components and talk a little bit more about them, which I think gives some appropriate context. So EPD stands for expected progeny differences. This expected component of an EPD is sort of our statistical definition of expected, which is a prediction in the future of a population average or mean. right? So always remembering, this is one of the biggest takeaways I'll have tonight, is that when we're thinking about EPDs, this is a prediction not of an individual's performance, but of the entire animal's progeny's average performance. So if this animal is to have an infinite number of progeny, this is what we would expect that average animal's performance to be. And the progeny component means that we're dealing with calves. The EPD is a trait, or the EPD is something that we're thinking about what a sire can contribute on to its future calf crops. And the differences component is really, EPDs are designed not to say anything about one animal, but they're allow us to compare between two animals, right? So an EPD on its own isn't necessarily useful. You have to have EPDs on multiple animals that you're using to make selection decisions for them to be of any use. And then it's also important to remember that these are calculated within populations. So a weaning weight EPD of 90 in Simmental is going to be different than an EPD weaning weight of 90 in Angus. So we have some crossbreed adjustments that we can do to EPDs if you're trying to compare crossbreeds, but really they're designed to be compared between individuals within a single population. So I'll go ahead here and walk through a little example of what EPDs look like in practice, where we have two bulls here, a black bull and a gold bull. The black bull with a weaning weight EPD of 2, the gold bull with a weaning weight EPD of 22. Again, this is all relevant to some base population. So this doesn't mean anything about what the gold bull's future progeny's weaning weights will be. But what it allows us to do is make comparisons between what we think the average calf crops of these two bulls will look like in the future. So based on these EPDs, we would expect that there would be a 20-pound difference between the calf crops of the gold bull versus the calf crops of the black bull. And so what we see is that if these two bulls have a whole bunch of progeny, an infinite number of progeny, I guess, is that we'd see a 20-pound difference between the average weaning weights of the calf crops of these two bulls. And again, I can't emphasize this enough. These are on normal distributions, right? These bell-shaped curves. But what EPDs are talking about are these differences in the means of these two bell-shaped curves, right? Just because you're sired by the black bull doesn't mean that you're going to be heavier than all of the calves of the gold bull. In fact, as you'll see here in this overlap point, all of these black bulls calves are heavier than the gold bull's calves that diverge to the left where these two normal distributions overlap. So just keeping in mind that you can, depending on the sample size of your herd, right, you could fall anywhere on these two normal distributions. But what EPDs are doing is they're acting as a tool for explaining the averages of our expectations of how these two bulls calf crops will perform in the future. And then the other thing that I'll mention about EPDs is that, like I said, there are our statistical estimate of an animal's true genetic merit. We never actually know what an animal's true genetic value is, but we can use statistics to estimate them with EPDs. And the way that this works is that as we're early on in the process with these young animals, and we don't have a lot of data in the form of offspring on these individuals, the EPD accuracies associated with these animals are going to be low. And so what that low EPD accuracy means is that we could see, as these animals have more and more progeny that enter the genetic evaluation, we could see this EPD shift pretty substantially from one side to another as more progeny are added for each of these two bulls. So you can conceive a certain situation where you get lots of unfavorable progeny records for this gold bull. His shifts downwards. The black bull gets lots of favorable progeny records, which means that he's probably higher in genetic potential than his parents. And all of a sudden you could see a re-ranking of these two bulls just based on the possible change that's associated with their low accuracy EPDs. But as we add more and more progeny to our genetic evaluation, we get higher EPD accuracies in a lower possible change. So EPD accuracy is kind of a nebulous thing on its own, but I really like thinking about it as possible change. And there's been a shift in some of these breed associations to reporting not only the EPD's accuracy, but also the possible change that you could experience in that EPD as that animal moves forward. So what I've done here is I brought an EPD report out for an anonymized red Simmental bull, as you'll see. And what we have here, each of these columns is the EPDs in a couple of selection indexes, which I'll talk about later. But with each of these EPDs, you'll see that there's the EPD reported. The PC stands for possible change. And this is basically saying that based on the accuracy of a particular EPD, this is the amount of possible change that you could experience in this EPD as that bull's accuracy approaches 100% or 1.0 in this case. So for example, this bull's accuracy, he's probably a genomically tested young bull, doesn't have any progeny records. But what you'll see is that since he's genomically tested, we have a moderate accuracy of his weaning weight EPD here, but you could still see an 8.5 pound-ish change in that animal's weaning weight as we add more progeny to the evaluation. And then the other important thing that I'll point out that are on all of these reports is the percentile ranking. So this percentile ranking is a score that shows where that animal ranks in the whole breed for his particular EPD, say in weaning weight. So the way we read this is that this bull is in the top 10% of all Simmental bulls for weaning weight. So he's a superior weaning weight bull, but again, we could see a significant change in that EPD as we continue to add animals to the evaluation. And I'll illustrate this a little bit further here, where we have sort of three classes of EPD accuracies. So the first, where we have a young calf, where we're just basically taking the average of its two parents' EPDs. You'll see that there's still some accuracy associated with these, but the possible change is really substantial. So this calf's EPD for weaning weight could change upwards of 13.5 pounds as we continue to add more information to the evaluation. Whereas down here, when we're looking at a high accuracy proven AI sire, the possible change associated with this EPD is fairly low, less than a pound shift that we could see either way, because this bull's EPD accuracy is upwards of 95, 96%. But the other thing to keep in mind, right, is that we don't want to just chase these high accuracy bulls, because in the case of this bull, if we were trying to decide between this moderate accuracy young bull, this high accuracy proven AI sire, the lower end of what this bull's EPD could be is still higher than what this bull's EPD will ever be, right? So if we're selecting on weaning weight, this moderate accuracy bull is probably going to be a better bet even than this high accuracy proven AI sire. Though the same thing might not be said for birth weight if you're trying to breed to heifers. So lots of considerations. I don't mean to intend to overwhelm with all of these numbers, but just something that maybe is helpful as you start to read some of these reports, particularly thinking about possible change in EPD accuracy as they relate to the amount of confidence that we have that this EPD represents an animal's true genetic merit. So it's also worth mentioning that accuracies are difficult to calculate, and I think a little bit too difficult for us to interpret. So I still have a hard time getting my mind around exactly what accuracy is measuring. But I think that this idea of thinking about possible change, most of these breeds, if they don't report that possible change directly on sort of their animal search page, a lot of them will have tables where you can go look at an accuracy in a particular trait and see how much you would expect that to possibly change over time. And then also recognizing that just like EPDs, accuracies aren't necessarily comparable across breeds. So an Angus accuracy of 0.75 for weaning weight doesn't equal a Simmental accuracy of 0.75 for weaning weight. So all things to keep in mind as we think about EPD accuracy. So on a more basic note, I want to talk about this idea of identifying the genetic differences between siblings. Okay, because really at the core of EPD calculation, this is what we're trying to do, whether we're talking about full siblings, related individuals, animals within a population, right? But this is something that we all know if we have siblings, right? That even though we each got 50% of our DNA from mom, 50% of our DNA from dad, there's still some pretty substantial differences between siblings. And the same goes for these two flush mates this little toy example that I've created, where even though they're from the same sire, the same dam, we see that there's a significant difference in the genetic merit of this animal compared with animal B. And the reason behind that is that this animal inherited a different proportion of his genomic DNA from this paternal grandsire, whereas this one got different chunks from its maternal granddam, maternal grandsire. Our expectation is that on average, these individuals are going to inherit about 25% of this grandparental DNA. But what you'll see is that that's certainly not the case in real life. This animal's getting more of its DNA from this paternal grandsire. And based on the genetic favorability of each of these grandparents, that allows us to see these differences in the genetic superiority of these full siblings. And so I'll sort of lay this out into an animal's genetic merit is a combination of its sire's EPD, so its sire's genetic merit, its dam's genetic merit, and then this thing that we call Mendelian sampling. And so what this really represents is that the sire and dam genetic potential is what we can account for the resemblance between relatives, right? So if you're a full sibling to a solid performing bull, you're probably also going to be a solid performer, just due to the fact that you share, you're bound to share some proportion of your parental DNA. But this Mendelian sampling term, depending on the trait, can account for a pretty big proportion of the differences that you'll see between siblings. So I like to think about this as the random sampling of genes, right? The dumb luck that you got the good genes from dad versus your sibling who maybe got the bad genes from dad. So this is really, when we're thinking about quantitative genetics, animal breeding, we're trying to figure out what this term is so that we can determine at an earlier state which one of these animals is superior, which one of these flush mates do I want to buy and turn out onto my cows. And so there are traditionally two ways that we can start to resolve these differences between siblings. The first is to have lots of calves, lots of progeny records. This is, again, going to increase the accuracy of the EPD because it helps us dial in on which proportions of this animal's genome he got from each of these grandparents. But more recently, what we've been able to do is that instead of waiting for lots of calf crops to roll in on these individuals, we can use genomics and get a better idea of tracking this actual DNA inheritance of which one of these grandparents maybe has an outsized proportion, accounts for an outsized proportions of this animal's genome. And so really, like I said, and I'll just reemphasize this, that if we're interested in trying to dial in on an animal's true genetic merit, our predictions here, represented as X's, without offspring phenotypes are going to be noisy, right? They're going to be based on the parental averages, but we're not going to have a good idea of what that Mendelian sampling, that random sampling of genes that animal inherited are. But as we add more data, we get more precise and accurate predictions. And so these predictions that we're able to generate cluster around what that animal's actual true genetic merit is. And this results in more accurate selection and a better idea of how that animal can improve your cow herd. And then, like I said, I'll wrap up talking about EPDs here with just a little bit about genomically enhanced EPDs and how they're just the next step in increasing the accuracy of EPDs, particularly on young animals. So the way that we've calculated EPDs since the 1960s or 70s, when these first genetic evaluations came out, is that because we have these big related individuals and pedigrees and performance recorded on animals and pedigrees, and then we can start to guess what an animal's own performance is, and then we have performance from all of this animal's progeny. All three of these things go into a traditional EPD and our prediction of that animal's genetic merit. And the big change that came with genomics isn't really that groundbreaking, right? But we basically figured out ways to build better relationship metrics between individuals based not only on the existing pedigree information, but we couple that with the DNA sharing information that we get from genomics. And this better resolution of the animal's relationships to all the members of the pedigree that have performance records allows us to report an EPD that's effectively the same, but with an increased level of accuracy. And so practically what this looks like is that these genomic tests are equivalent to progeny records. So what I'm showing here is a table adapted from the American Angus Association, where we're looking at different traits that Angus reports EPDs on. In this column labeled PE stands for progeny equivalent. So this is telling us how many progeny records we would have to add to the evaluation to get the same jump in accuracy that we get from a DNA test on this individual. So really what we're getting here is close to a calf crop's worth of information for some of these traits based on a genetic test before these animals have ever put a single calf on the ground. And again, this is just increasing our certainty, particularly in young animals, that the animal's EPD is reflective of the actual genetics that they're going to be passing on in your commercial herd. So what this allows us to do is accelerate genetic progress because we're able to buy these young unproven bulls, but with reduced risk. It's going to increase our confidence that we're maybe not going to have a major calving ease disaster if we see a big jump in that EPD one way or another. So we're reducing the risk, and it's allowing us to select younger bulls and advance that genetic progress in our herds. So the practical way that we can utilize genomics in our herds, the biggest, easiest, best way to do that is always use a bull with genomically enhanced EPDs. This is going to increase, again, the accuracy and reliability of these EPDs, equivalent somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 33 progenies worth of information that we're adding. And the biggest thing, like I said, that we're doing is reducing the risk in these young, unproven bulls. There's really no excuse to not use bulls without genomically enhanced EPDs. We've got all of the major breed associations in some capacity are calculating genomically enhanced EPDs. And I think that most of the requirements when it comes to state subsidies for bull purchases, I think that genomic tests are a requirement, but which I think is a really good requirement, again, reducing the probability that we experience a train wreck of some sort in our cow herd. So just to switch things up here, we've got another question, if Courtney wants to put it up. Does your herd bull have genomically enhanced EPDs? Yes, no, I don't know, which is a fine answer, or it's not applicable if you're just on tonight watching Troy talk for fun.
I'll give about 15 more seconds if you haven't been able to answer yet. Okay, Troy, sharing results with you.
All righty. So yeah, just about 50% of people reported that their bull does have genomically enhanced EPDs. Another 26% that aren't sure, and 20% that don't. So I think that that's pretty good. We've been slowly chipping away at making progress on genomic testing in the beef industry. This is something that pretty immediately just happened in the dairy industry because of the nature of progeny testing young bulls there. But something that I think we still have some room to improve on, but we've done a really good job at implementing in the beef industry over the last 10 or so years. All right, so with that, I want to close this sort of EPD selection, this EPD section rather, with the idea that accuracy is important, but it's not the only thing, right? This is something that I have to remind myself. A lot of the work that we do in animal breeding is trying to generate accurate breeding values for producers. But the fact is that a lot of times, if you get completely caught up chasing accuracy, sometimes you're sacrificing the genetic progress of bulls that are, a couple generations ahead maybe of that very, very proven AI sire that you've used for the last few years. So make sure that you're constantly trying to balance this idea of making genetic progress, selecting based on EPDs, but not being too tied but yeah, again, making sure that these EPDs are accurate enough, but that you're still making genetic progress, if that makes sense. So one thing that I'll leave before I stop talking about genetic prediction is that all of a sudden these genomic tests have become more and more affordable over the last 5 or so years. It's no longer something that's just reserved for the seed stock segment of the industry. There are a lot of companies that have started to put together some pretty compelling and affordable products for utilizing genomics in commercial heifer herds. And this is something that I'm sure you'll hear me talk more about in depth in the future. But utilizing genomics in your commercial herd to not only do selection, so choosing the right animals is going to be a more accurate experience when you're using genomics versus just finding animals that maybe fit the eye test to be replacements. But also beyond this additional information for selection decisions, adding value on the marketing side based on this genomic information is something that I think has a lot of potential to increase the profitability of our commercial herds. So there are a lot of added value genetics companies out there that are starting to utilize this genomic information maybe on a heifer crop to inform the genetic potential of a steer crop to help you get paid for improving your genetics, right? So there's lots of potential here, and I'm happy to answer questions about this or talk to people offline about this, because I think there's a lot of potential to utilize genomic tests of all sorts to improve our commercial cow herds. And then I'll sort of add the caveat in here that this is going to be another one of those it depends cases where not all genomic tests are created equal. So depending on the breed makeup for your cow herd particularly is going to change how we choose genomic tests and how we market these animals. But again, something that I'm really excited and passionate about that I think could add a lot of dollars to commercial cow herds here in Tennessee. So the last thing that I'm going to talk about is what to do if we want to select for multiple traits at once, right? Almost all the time our selection goal is going to encompass multiple traits as we work towards one sort of thing that makes us the most profitable cow herd possible. And so my answer to this is, what trait do we want to select for the most? And I think we want to select for the trait that matters the most. So I'll give us the final question of the night, which trait, regardless of production system, is most important? So go ahead and take a little time and answer that, and then I'll
I'm curious about this one, Troy, because you know my tagline, right?
Yeah, I do.
Okay. I didn't want to say too much and give away what your answer might be.
Okay.
What's your answer, Justin, since you can't log in, just so we know?
I'm not going to do that because it might lead into what he's trying to do with this. I don't want to spoil anything.
Okay.
I'll stay here to see what he says, and then I'll give my response just after that.
Okay. All right. So yeah, pretty even split on birth weight and yearling weight. The majority of folks say weaning weight, and then sort of peters off into things like milk, marbling, and ribeye area. So I'll give a little context, and Justin, you can shout what you think here. This is actually trick question number 4. Did you have a different answer, Justin?
Yes.
What's your answer?
Fertility. Well, just if it's females, I'll say this: pregnant.
Okay, that's a pretty good one, and I think that plays into what my answer to this trick question is, and that's profit, right? So regardless of what your end marketing goal is, right, we need to select for animals that are profitable, that aligns with our breeding goal, right? So particularly if we're retaining replacement heifers, right? Making sure that we're appropriately selecting for fertility alongside those other production traits that are paying us at the end of the year, are all things that contribute to this idea of profitable animals. And the way that we're able to select for profitable animals is using an economic selection index. So I'll talk about selection indexes here. I'm coming up on an hour, so I'll sort of breeze through this, but so we have plenty of time to answer questions. But when it comes to economic selection indexes, what they are is basically this combination of EPDs weighted according to their economic value in a certain production context, right? And so what this allows us to do is that instead of expressing a value in terms of a weight, or in terms of an end, whether it's ribeye area, your weight at weaning, whatever that might be, what we're expressing these economic selection indexes in are dollar values. And so what we're doing is that we're making some assumptions about a production scheme, but we're able to directly quantify profit and compare different bulls with each other based on the profitability that we expect from their offspring. And so this takes a lot of the guesswork out of doing genetic selection, because we're able to deal with these correlated traits. And these things are really, really well calibrated to work across a variety of environmental contexts, across a variety of production schemes to really help you quantify and easily select for profitable animals. And so different breeds are going to have different indexes, and there are going to be different indexes for different marketing endpoints. So this is where it becomes really important that you know and understand and utilize a breeding goal, because if you're selecting for the wrong index and not experiencing the profit at the end of the day, that's definitely not ideal when we're obviously trying to make these more profitable beef cattle herds. So some of the common selection indexes that you have maybe heard, most breeds have something in the way of an economic selection index. Angus has 6 or 7 now, I think. And there are really 2 classes of these that we can start to describe. So either a maternal / all-purpose index. So this is going to be an index that either focuses on maternal traits or pre-weaning growth, or in some cases, sort of all the traits that a particular breed association reports. So these are going to be the more well-rounded indexes that work across a variety of different production contexts, as well as there are these more focused terminal and carcass indexes. They're typically going to be better for operations that are retaining ownership of their animals through the feedlot and selling on some sort of a performance-based grid, so that you're actually getting compensated for animals that have superior genetic potential for carcass traits. So in Angus, we have dollar maternal, so a purely maternally focused index. This composite index that takes into account every single EPD in the Angus evaluation, and a dollar W for weaning index. So this is going to be focused again on the pre-weaning gain, whereas we get the dollar F for feedlot, sort of feedlot performance post-weaning gain, the grid, dollar G, that accounts for that purely for carcass traits, and then a dollar B that's a combination of these 2. And then for other breeds, they'll maybe just have 2. So in Red Angus, we have the herd builder, focused again on more maternal traits, pre-weaning gain, and then the grid master, which is more focused on those terminal carcass traits. And the same goes for our Simmental animals, where we have either an all-purpose index or this terminal index. And so I think that this, before I talk too much more about the specifics of these indexes, I think that this little experiment that Top Dollar Angus, they're an added value genetics company, did a few years back to really field test whether selecting for animals that have high dollar values, these high economic selection indexes, actually translates to increased profit on the ground. And what we see here is that they did this neat little experiment where they used embryos from flushes to produce 2 cohorts of calves. So one that has this a low average dollar B. So again, this dollar B index is focused on post-weaning gain and performance on a carcass-based grid, and then these high dollar B calves. And so what we see here is that there's a pretty big difference in the estimated dollar values of these animals. They also do genomic tests on these animals. And what they see before we start to actually field test how these animals perform and how they paid out is that using this GeneMax Advantage test for commercial animals, you see that the feeder advantage, which again is sort of reflective of the genomic component of feedlot profitability, you see that when we divide animals based on their GeneMax feeder score, they cluster out into these two groups, which reflects the genetic estimates. The genomic tests agree with one another, which is good. But what we're really interested in, right, is the actual profit differences that we see between these two groups of animals. And so what we see is that our predicted difference, the breeding values for these two animals' dollar beef is $187 per head. So we'd expect that to be the average difference per head. But what we see is much greater than that, over $215 difference in the profitability of these two classes of calves. And so what you'll observe is there's a lot going on in this table, but as we look across all of these things that are getting us paid on the merit-based grid, this post-weaning gain, age to harvest, these animals were finishing out quicker, these high versus low dollar beef calves, at heavier carcasses, higher marbling, bigger ribeyes, less back fat, lower yield grade. So we were making these animals, when we just divide them based on this dollar B index, there are some real biological differences in them. And at the end of the day, they lead to much higher levels of profit than their low dollar beef value contemporaries. And again, the thing that's really great about these dollar indexes is they're one value, an easy thing to select on, so you're not trying to balance 12 different EPDs. And they're robust to a lot of different environments. They capture a suite of traits, and they've been extensively researched and calibrated. I was talking to some folks at Angus a while back about how all the economics that goes into these things is really complex, down to the sort of average amount that a feedlot employee is getting paid per hour affects how these get calibrated. So really direct indicators of how profitable one animal's calves will be compared to another. So again, some of the big questions to ask before you pick an index to select on is, am I keeping replacement heifers? If so, you want to pick an index that's going to reflect the genetic progress that you want to see on the female side. Like Justin said, getting heifers that are high fertility, cows that are long-lived. And if you're retaining ownership of calves, you want to get compensated for that carcass performance at the end of the day. So picking an index that combines these depending on the needs of your herd is really important. So before you go all in on an index, I think it's important to take a step back and think about what component traits go into the index and how does that align with the things that I want to improve in my cow herd. So in the case of Angus here, you'll notice that if you're selecting for dollar B, right, so high post-weaning gain and carcass performance, but you're retaining replacement heifers, you're missing out on the profitability that you can be adding in some of these other traits that deal with the more maternal aspects of cattle production by just using this dollar B index. So basically, my gist with this is think about what your breeding goal is and see which traits you want to make progress on, what's going to contribute to profitability in your herd. And then we can start to make decisions about which one of these indexes, or do you need to balance an index in keeping an eye on other sort of EPDs and traits to continue making genetic progress on. So I'll skip this, but the big takeaway here is that indexes are going to make assumptions about your herd, but keep in mind that they're really robust to a lot of different production schemes. And so since I've gone a little bit over the time that I intended here, I want to leave some time for questions. I'll do a quick wrap up here as we start to think about how we do sire selection in commercial herds. I think that the biggest thing is having a breeding goal and keeping in mind that the breeding decisions that you're making on sires are going to have an outsized impact on your herd. All right. As you keep replacement heifers, especially making sure that that sire is something that you're confident in, and knowing that he's going to trickle down for multiple generations. His daughters are going to stay in production. They're going to have calves. That's a really, really big, important decision that you're making when you're picking a sire. So using all the tools that you can, whether that's crossbreeding, EPDs, or a selection index, to make sure that that aligns with what makes your herd profitable is ultimately the most important thing that you can do as it relates to sire selection. So with that, I have gone on for long enough. Like I said when I started, I really am excited about being in Tennessee. I hope that I can act as a resource to you all moving forward as I continue to get to know not only the Tennessee beef industry better, but just understand all of the things that go into to beef cattle production nationwide. It's something that I'm constantly learning and constantly trying to keep pushing on. So I want to be a resource for you in any way possible. Email me, call me at my office number. If you're on Twitter and are so inclined, feel free to tweet at me, shoot me a direct message, whatever works to get a hold of me. I want to be a resource to you for all things genetic, genomic, however, moving forward. So with that, I will quit talking here and start taking some questions. So thanks for your attention and hanging out with me on a Monday night.
That's great, Troy, and we're glad you're excited to be in Tennessee, because we're certainly excited to have you here and what's to come with your research and also with your extension work here, having both research and extension appointment. That's something I didn't mention in the introduction. So it's great to have you on the team and be out and across the state doing some work here, hopefully for a lot of years to come. Let's start with somewhat of a basic kind of a question. With this many folks on the webinar, we do have some that are just getting started in the beef industry. And a question came in about genetically and genomically enhanced EPDs and just how it works, as far even from taking a sample from the individual, sending it in, and then I think you covered a lot of how it gets incorporated in EPDs, though, but just the basics of it.
Right. And that's a slide that I typically have in here, but I pulled out for time constraint reasons. But really the process that goes along from being a piece of the cow to being implemented in a genetic evaluation is a pretty quick process. We take some sort of a tissue sample, whether that's a blood sample onto, they have blood cards for preservation. It can be a hair sample, though I think we've moved away from hair samples a little bit. Probably the most common thing now is to do a tissue punch out of an animal's ear. Allflex has made a little device like an ear tagger to punch out and puts it in a little tube that you send off to a genotyping service provider. And they have all the equipment and the actual genomic technology to pull out those genotypes. It's often about 50,000 differences in the cow genome. They're sort of evenly spaced that allow us to start recognizing the differences between animals, right? That's the name of the game for us. So we turn those molecular genotypes into numerical phenotypes, or into numerical values that we put into these prediction equations. And in the outcome, right, is this more accurate genomically enhanced EPD. And in different breed associations do this slightly differently. So in Angus, really, in Angus, Charolais, a handful of other breeds, what they're doing is using the genomic information to just make a more accurate pedigree, whereas other breeds are actually calculating the amount of genetic value that's added by each of these genotyped markers, and then summing those up across the genome, and then blending that back together with the pedigree. Again, something that I'm still wrapping my head around every day. But there's different ways of doing it, but the end results are basically equivalent, and they end up in being just this more accurate prediction tool for you to utilize in your herd.
And maybe just to get in that in a little bit more detail, if I'm understanding the latter example there correctly, that's based on just kind of single base pair switches in the DNA sequence. And then you accumulate enough of that to put together and kind of correlate. It really would be the more accurate statement. It's not a causative relationship necessarily, but correlate that with different performances, phenotypes, as a geneticist would call it.
Right.
Is that correct to say?
Yeah. So what we're looking for are differences in the cattle genome, right? And across all cows, there's millions and millions of these differences. But what we figured out is that because of the nature of cows' history since they were domesticated, and the population structure that we have in these breeds, is that we figured out that just by genotyping about 50,000 of these pretty common differences. So things that are fairly average to high frequency in most of the populations that we're looking at. Instead of tagging every little difference, we're tagging these chunks with evenly spaced markers, which in cattle is enough to assign genetic values to these chunks of DNA that is inherited, because you're inheriting DNA not by the single base pair, but in these big sort of continuous chunks. And because we're able to do that with a relatively low number of markers fairly accurately, then like Justin said, we can start to get towards figuring out which of those animals got the sort of favorable chunks in that random sampling of genes.
I think I understood most of that, and actually that's a better explanation than I've ever been able to comprehend, I guess, as far as just thinking about the base pair switches and single nucleotide polymorphisms. That makes a lot of sense. That's a good way to answer that question. And I want to kind of transition over into something that I know for a fact, just in discussion with you, that you think a lot about, and I'll just try to paraphrase the question here that's in the Q&A box, but talking about in some, well, I don't want to get too specific here. Maybe I'll just ask you your take on whole herd reporting and the importance of not just testing animals that you're interested in marketing one way or the other, or that kind of thing, just the cream of the crop kind of a situation.
Sure, that's a really good question, and again, something that I think a lot about, particularly in the context of doing genetic prediction for these female and cow longevity traits, which are, again, the hardest things to make genetic progress on. But in order to do this accurately, so if we want to think about something like stayability, so stayability is the probability that a bull's daughters will remain in the herd at 6 years of age, right? So this is, for commercial cow producers, really important, right? Getting those long-lived cows. But the only way that we're able to accurately calculate these sorts of EPDs is when we're reporting records on the entire cow herd, right? Not skipping over registering a calf the year that, or not necessarily registering a calf, but if we're skipping records on cows the years that she has a calf that maybe doesn't get registered, we're missing out on information that cow successfully had a calf. She's still in the herd. And the flip side of that too is that in addition to not being able to make these selection tools for things like heifer pregnancy and stayability, when we're selectively registering just the top portion of our calves, we're actually discounting those animals that are genetically superior. So if you have an outlier individual who's far above average, but you cut off the lower end of that distribution, that far superior animal looks a little bit less superior than he is in reality. So full herd reporting, whole herd reporting, total herd enrollment, it goes by lots of different names and breeds, I think is really important as we move forward, not only in making the most accurate contemporary groups, which is again going to boost our EPD accuracy, but also developing these tools for longer lived heifers and cows is all things that I think a lot about, and stuff that I think that breed associations that don't require it should start to think about. So I'm not sure how exactly that long convoluted answer got to your question, Justin, but hopefully somewhere in the right neighborhood.
It really does. And I think that's, for a lot of our seed stock producers that are on tonight, that's something that they think about in a lot of different ways. Some that are doing whole herd reporting, kind of thinking how that affects them, relative to a competitive advantage or not in marketing. So no, I think that was a great answer. And just knowing what we've talked about before with the take on whole herd reporting, something that really wanted to get in, and glad that question was asked. I'm going to I should tell you that the next person on, so next Monday will be Dave Lawman. And I'm not sure, you're probably familiar with some of the work he's done more recently and talked about in a lot of places on the movement of EPDs in general. I think he concentrates a lot on kind of the performance EPDs that mean a lot to cow-calf producers, marketing, weaning, or yearling. How those numbers move but we might not see a correlated movement in average performance of commercial cattle, just across the country. Um, he'll be addressing that, I think, in a lot more detail, something you may want to hook on and listen to next week. But what are your thoughts on that? We can move these numbers pretty dramatically and fairly quickly at the very top end of our breed registries, but maybe don't always see that kind of movement in our commercial cattle coming along with those genetics. Any thoughts on that, or am I asking the question correctly?
Yeah, I think I get what you're asking, and I think that the answer is that a lot of commercial cow herds are still, utilizing phenotypic selection on these performance traits, right? So when we're, like I said, when we're doing, and again, I taken all the slides out. I should have left them all at the end here, but when we're doing phenotypic selection, we're not using the most accurate selection to get at these performance traits that we're interested in measuring. That sacrifice in prediction accuracy means that we're not going to see the same amount of genetic progress in the average commercial, in the commercial cow herd throughout the United States, right? So we can make genetic progress in these pure breeds, right? But unless commercial cow herds are utilizing these EPDs in a widespread manner, they're always going to, anytime that we're not using them as much as the seed stock producers are using EPDs, that value is always going to lag when we look at commercial cattle. So I think as we continue to optimize our commercial cow production, utilizing EPDs, calculating EPDs that are relevant to the commercial cow herds, right? So I think about things like feet and legs that traditionally we've had to rely on the eye test for. But just within the last few years, we've got all these breed associations that are starting to report more of these type traits, something that the dairy industry has been really good at, but making selection tools for things that we used to just rely on the eye test for will help us continue to make genetic progress across all of these traits. So even outside of the performance-based traits, just more and more relevant selection tools so that we can do more accurate selection in the commercial cow herd, can sort of accelerate that genetic progress over time.
Yeah, and I like that answer. I like the comparison you made to the dairy industry, and honestly, if you think about our industry in relation to say poultry or swine production, like you mentioned a couple of times through the presentation, if the genetic selection at those progenitor type herd levels trickle down as concentrated as it does in those other protein industries, then it might be a different story, right? And I guess it's just a more disparate type adoption across the country in that relation.
Sure.
But as we wrap up, I'm going to kind of take a moderator prerogative and wrap up with something that is near and dear to my heart too. And I'm glad to have a colleague that talks about it as much as you do, and that's heterosis. One thing that might be a little bit different or something we haven't talked a lot about, at least in Master Beef Producer, would be using heterosis in sires. And we have mentioned it some, but specifically how you might manage heterosis in a herd if you're using, say, an F1 sire versus a composite, or how that kind of moves toward just its own breed. Generally, those kinds of thoughts. You want to riff on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think that the introduction of these open herd book breeds. So the one that comes to mind immediately for me is Simmental, right? But the same thing can be said for Limousine with Limflex and Gelby for Balancer. Seeing value in these F1 bulls is an easy way to introduce heterosis into your herd, I think, right? But the big challenge has historically been we can't calculate, or we didn't have a great way of calculating EPDs on crossbred animals. But all of a sudden with these big open herd book breeds, and all of a sudden big international multi-breed evaluations, we can get accurate EPDs on crossbred bulls. And all of a sudden we can double up on that heterosis, both on the the bull side, he's gonna contribute some heterotic performance in a complementary manner to your cow herd. So in a lot of cases, if you're doing this right, we can have up to 4 breeds in a pretty straightforward manner that we're utilizing to exploit all the heterosis possible. So I think you're totally right, Justin, that as we move forward, these crossbred bulls are becoming easier to acquire. They have reliable EPDs reported on them. So I think that they're going to be really big tools as we move forward and keep trying to maximize our profitability through heterosis.
That's great. And that's exactly where I hoped I would lead you. And you took the bait perfectly, talking about even getting EPDs on our commercial herds and using that for heifer selection. You indicated some of that there toward the end of your presentation. So there are so many great questions in the Q&A. I wish we could stay on here another hour and a half and kind of talk about them all, but realizing that we need to do a hard stop here, I think that'll bring us to our last question. And it kills me to have to leave these good questions in here, but the nature of things as they are, I'm glad you put up your contact information. There's plenty of stuff to talk about here. I'm sure you get a lot of questions after this, and plenty of fodder for extension publications and presentations in the future. So with that, Troy, I'd like to really just sincerely thank you for spending the time to put together just an outstanding presentation. Talk about some things that might be some new concepts and out there on the edge of what we should be thinking about and how to select sires and use these concepts in our commercial herds, and keep trying to improve the Tennessee beef cattle production and the sustainability of it through enhanced productivity. So I appreciate it, Troy.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Justin. And like you said, I hope that this was a good launching point, right? That'll help me as I hear more from you all, sort of target where my future extension programming goes and how I can provide you all with resources to make the most genetic progress that y'all can in your herd. So thanks again for having me, and thanks for sticking on and listening to me.
Great. Thank you again. Courtney, is there anything else we need to cover before we wrap it up this evening?
I don't think so, but just again, as soon as I end the meeting, you should get the survey link. If you don't, do not freak out. I have it set to send 24 hours after the webinar as well, so you should get one tomorrow night. If you don't, you can email your A&R agent or myself, and I can send you the link. And then someone asked about slides. They're a little too large for me to send on a large audience scale, but your A&R agent also has access to those and can get you the slides if you would like that.
So I think a lot of that reason is I've got a ton of pictures and stuff in here. So I'll make a PDF set of slides and send them your way, Courtney, and you can distribute them as you see fit.
Okay.
And one last thing
That works.
to that end as well, as you were talking about e-beef, I copied the link to the chat. So everybody, right quick, if you want to scroll up in your chat a little bit, you should see a link to e-beef at ucdavis.edu. You can click that and have that tab open for some resources as well. Okay. Is that good, Courtney?
Yeah. All good. Thank you.
Thanks again, Troy.
Bye.